time to believe, but nonetheless, you can ask around among hospice workers and physicians who've dealt with the terminally ill, and it is absolutely the case that many people, even if they've been obtunded for days and days, will just prior to life, to dying, they will sort of sit up and they'll come to, and they seem more alive than alive, even like they're already. Sometimes in this state, they seem to light up with a light that's not of this dimension at all. And again, these are things that sound very startling to talk about, but if you ask around among people who work with the terminally ill, this is just a occurrence common enough that almost anybody in that profession will know about this.
That's right. And, I mentioned that was a brief flash. My mother laying motionless for 3 weeks suddenly sat up, turned to look right in my eyes. So very startling. And so I think, yes, this is the way it works. And look how many people will say that the departed spouse comes back, to communicate with them, or they stay in communication. I mean, this is a common thing. And at first it looks like wives' tales, but now with the proof and the evidence that Raymond has presented and others, I think there's no question about it anymore.
Yeah, there's confirmation, and so people will come out and begin sharing their experiences. They feel more, they can open up and share. I think a lot of people feel a lot of emotional pain, a lot of unfinished business, things like that come with the dying process. So I think this will add a whole element that will lighten things up so that people, they'll take the opportunity for healing during those.
What's going to happen, now I'm going to guess into the future, Raymond and KG, is that we won't be talking about death anymore, because probably there is no such thing as death. And it's merely like changing trains. We go to the next or a different level, different dimension. And it's kind of like waking up in a new dream, leaving one dream, going to another dream. This is the way it works. And I don't think we'll talk about death and grieving. And actually, we should be celebrating when a life well-lived comes to an end, and know that they're going on to continue other good work. So I think this is what the change will be.
And I think also it's grief is, when it exists, it is the most painful of human emotions. And I think that another aspect of this work that Jack and I do is that this does give hope for people who are grieving, and it demonstrably comforts people in the grieving process. And I think also for the very many people who are afraid of death and who are perhaps not living life to the fullest because of their fear of death, I think this new work absolutely does. And I mean new work, not talking about me personally, but the work of Jack and of myself and of our colleagues in this field who investigate these things, that I think it's pretty demonstrable that these experiences do soften the fear of death. I know that because I've heard people telling me this ever since I first started lecturing about these experiences, which was in about 1970. And so over the 40 years that I've been in the public arena about this is something I hear more or less constantly from people, is that knowing about this information gives them hope and helps console them in the face of a loss of a loved one, and also helps them with their fear of death.
Yes, and I think shifting our consciousness to that we are eternal beings, I think that changes everything.
Well, it really does. And you know what it does to me is it makes me wonder what this place we're in is all about. I mean, since this is a fairly new thing to me that I've sort of been maneuvered almost into a situation where I've got to say that the most plausible and honest thing to say is that there's an afterlife, then that really makes this state of existence we're in now a lot more mysterious. I mean, what is this all about? It's in a funny sort of way, my own insight, and that this is the way it is, that there is an afterlife, that it's really made this life that we're in much more puzzling. Like, what's this all about? Mm-hmm. And again, the best answer I've come up with is the one that I heard from George Ritchie in 1965, and I've heard from thousands of people since that time, which is basically that this seems to be God's educational medium that we're in, and it seems to have to do with learning to love mm-hmm. more than anything else, and pursuing knowledge. As another thing you often hear people say who've been through this is that they a very common after effect is after somebody has one of these experiences is that they say that they go down to the local community college to sign up for courses because this experience really does make us very aware of our own ignorance in a very positive way. I mean, if people have just been getting through life without much curiosity, and then they have an experience like this, it really creates in them an impassioned desire to learn. Mm-hmm. One of the best friends I ever had was this wonderful woman named Vi Horton, who had her near-death experience in May of 1971. And I got to know Vi and her older sisters very well. And her older sisters told me that prior to her near-death experience, that she had, that her common reading matter was romance novels, was the only thing she ever read. But after Vi had her experience, she used to come to visit my wife and me for a couple of weeks at a time. She loved our children, and she took care of them a lot for us. And but Vi would raid my library of philosophy books and mm-hmm. psychology books, and sometimes would read like 2 books a day and would understand the material. And she, as I've heard from quite a number of other patients with extremely lengthy cardiac arrest, talk about that they become aware almost of another plane of existence that has to do with the pursuit of knowledge. Mm-hmm. As George Ritchie put it, he said, that this learning is not something that stops when you die, but that goes on quite literally, George mm-hmm. says, for eternity. So that just recently I heard a man, actually by coincidence, this was a man from Hawaii, an artist, this filmmaker told me about this friend of his who had lost his son from an accident, and he said then his son shortly thereafter came back to him and said that he was, in effect, he compared this life to a university, and that this process of knowledge is something that goes on even in what we call death. But as Jack was saying, and as I heard also Robert Kestenbaum, who used to be the editor of the Omega Journal, which is the Journal of Death Education, and about, I guess, 15, 16 years ago, Bob Kestenbaum said to me that he had begun to think in the course of his career that death itself changes. In other words, that what we call death in any one era is not the same as we call death in some other era. I mean, for example, these people who undergo these surgeries in which all of the blood is drained out of their brain to repair an aneurysm, for example, and they're put into a severely hypothermic condition, so their body temperature is way down, and then they stop the heart beating, and then they drain the blood from the patient's head. And this Jack would be able to say how long these operations go on, but as I recall, it's about an hour or so. But and during that time, these people have no brain waves or whatever. And so, what would you say about that? Then the people are, then they are heated up again. The blood is reinfused into their body. They're warmed up, and their heart is started again. And my goodness, they're alive again. Well, what do we call that state? Then, I would like to know, Jack. I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, I know that when you and I went to medical school, the thing that Pam Reynolds was in would have been called death.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit, Raymond. Yeah, you and I started medical school the same year, in 1972. Is that not correct?
That's right.
That's right. So here's the thing with Pam Reynolds, and that's a famous case, and I mentioned it in my book. And the reason, Dr. Spetzler was the surgeon in charge, and he kindly wrote the foreword for my book. I really appreciate that. I think he's one of the best, if not the best.
He is. He is a good man. He's a good man.
He certainly is. Now, here's what he told me. I met him at one conference. This is way before I thought about writing a book, but I knew about this case. And I said, Bob, I have a question for you. I said, at the time this happened with Pam Reynolds, which we'll talk about what happened in a minute, and her near-death experience, I said, did you know about such things? And he looked at me, he said, Jack, absolutely not. He said, I had never heard of out-of-the-body or near-death experiences. And he said, I find it simply astounding that the brain could produce such hallucinations when it is electrically silent. Now, this is what he told me. Now, the case of Pam Reynolds was a pseudonym for a lady who was a musician, country western, entertainer, I guess, and she's passed on recently. She finally did make that final journey. But what happened was this. She had an aneurysm of the brain, that's kind of a ballooning out, which was prone to rupture, but it was deep in the brain. And I believe technically it was called a basilar tip aneurysm. Now, to get to this is very difficult and actually carries so much risk that he felt, let's do this cardiac standstill procedure. And here's what they do, as Raymond said, they cool the body down. Now, in Pim von Nommel's great book, Consciousness Beyond Life, he talks about this case, and he said the cooling was to a value of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But actually, I called Dr. Spetzler's office and spoke with the physiologist who was on that case, and it was 60 degrees is about the temperature they cool the body.